We are back. We are here with Chris Cotillo of Mass Live. You can find him on Twitter at Chris Cotillo. Nice and easy. But Chris, you're back on our podcast. We loved having you on the first time. We're so happy that you made the time to come back. How are you doing?
I'm good. Anything for you, Chris.
Oh, wow.
Aw.
And Mike.
He doesn't hear that too often.
Yeah,
You know?
no, that's very rare in my life. No,
I was
but
talking
actually,
I was talking in the third person, so
Oh, gotcha. Even better.
yeah.
Nicely done. I got to know Chris a little bit actually, and I want to plug it now before I forget. He does a great workshop, and you could find it on his Twitter feed. It's I think, what was it, 4 sessions of a sports writing workshop, which I actually took, and it was a great time. I learned a lot, so I definitely recommend anybody who wants to advance further. Maybe as a writer or in the baseball industry, definitely recommend signing up for it. So I just wanted to plug that. Go to Chris's Twitter feed and you could find his info and email him about that. But Chris, let's get right into it. Want to ask you about the Red Sox here, and honestly, I feel like they've surprised a little bit this season. I guess maybe for me especially, like I really thought this team was going to be pretty bad this year, and they're hanging in there. They are, I believe, in third place at this point. The offense has been really good. The pitching, Chris Sale has gotten back to his old form. James Paxton has come back. So just tell us overall, what are the vibes right now in Boston around this team?
Well, no one's noticed yet because they're too busy bitching about the Celtics, who are about to have their season end here. And I'll give you my one basketball take of all time is never build your team around a Duke guy, hint like Jason Tatum. But
that's an excellent point, actually.
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm a little biased in that regard, but I'll stand by it. Go Heels. I think that with the Red Sox, they have flown under the radar locally just because there was so much hype around the Bruins and the Celtics, who obviously both had disappointing playoff runs. But this is a team that has been interesting. They've been competitive and they've been relevant again. Last year they got off to a horrible start in April. They had an amazing May. And then, kind of went back to average and then below average and then ended up cratering. Here, a pretty good start, and they sit, as we record this, 4 games above 500. As you said, Chris, the offense has been great. You've seen guys like Alex Verdugo off to a hot start. Jarren Duran has come up and been really good. Adam Duvall for the week before he got hurt was excellent. They've gotten kind of production out of catcher that you'd never expect. Connor Wong, Reese McGuire. Devers hasn't even been himself. So, I think the offense, they really thought that it would be a different offense. Obviously, Yoshida's been a huge part of it. Grinding at bats, getting on base, not striking out as much, which is something that, there was a lot of quick innings last year, a lot of non-competitive at bats. You're not seeing that on a night-to-night basis from this team. And pitching-wise, the bullpen, I think, it's really kind of rounded into form. Jansen, other than the last couple outings, have been a little bit shaky, but was dominant for the first 6 weeks. They have a lot of guys at the back end of the bullpen with experience, which is something you couldn't say, over the last few years. Chris Martin, John Schreiber's hurt right now, but a guy who's pitched well for them. And they're going to have a lot of multi-inning weapons back there too. Cutter Crawford, Josh Winkowski have been good, really good. Nick Pivetta is now back there. So, it's a staff with a lot of depth, and they're finally, I think, for the first time all season, going to be at full strength over the weekend when Garrett Whitlock comes back. So, for this team, a team that's had so many injuries, to Paxton missing 6 weeks, to Whitlock being on the IL now twice, to Bayo starting out hurt, Duvall, getting hurt a week into the season, and there's random guys playing, starting at shortstop. Pablo Reyes, a guy I'd never heard of, right? Emmanuel Valdez has come up and been good. Like, they've been able to piece this together. It's a more functional roster than last year. It's a team with more depth. There's been some, breakout performances, like I said, Yoshida, Verdugo early, stuff like that. But, they're just kind of finding ways, I think, to grind. And, as Chris Russo came on my pod earlier today and said, the team is feisty. I think that's a good way to put it. Leave it to him to be have a better way to say it than someone who covers the team on a day-to-day basis. But I think that's what they are, and they played really good competition. So they're not the best team in baseball. They are not probably the most talented, but they're putting themselves in a position where they can be competitive before they get the reinforcements. Even before the trade deadline, they should have Adam Duvall, Trevor Story, other guys back. And that's kind of, shows that there is a ceiling there.
I want to ask you more specifically about those reinforcements. They've got several guys on the way back. You mentioned Trevor Story, Adam Duvall, Whitlock coming back, scheduled to start this Saturday, Adalberto Mondesi. So I guess if we could just quickly go through each one. So starting with Mondesi, how long do you think it's going to be before we see him back?
This is the greatest mystery facing the Red Sox these days. This is a guy who, they didn't give up much for him, just a lefty reliever in Josh Taylor, who's been back and forth between AAA and the majors, but a guy they thought had upside even with 1 year left. He has not progressed at all. He's not in game action. He's not, facing live pitching. I don't think at Fort Myers. He is just at a point where his ACL recovery has not, gone as quickly as they thought. He had hopes at the beginning of spring training that he'd be able to, get into games and maybe be ready for opening day. At this point, not even close. There's no timetable on him. And so I don't think they're counting on much out of him at this point.
That's just a story of his career, man. It's just always, he is so slow to come back from injuries.
Right. Really and so talented too. And I think that's the tough part, never reaching that potential.
Absolutely.
Trevor Story, do we see him before the All-Star break?
I think right around then, maybe to start the second half, something like that. They're going to slow play it just because, the interesting thing about the procedure he had, the internal bracing procedure, is that he's not the first person to have it by any means, but this is not a Tommy John track where you have, decades and decades of recoveries. This is a relatively new procedure. And so there's only, a small amount of data on how long it takes guys to come back. With that being said, I think they're going to, slow play it. He's gotten to a point. He's so athletic that they, are very, pleased with the recovery to this point. But they're still going to follow the map. He's hitting. He's fielding. I think he's back in Fort Myers. He was home in Dallas. His wife gave birth a couple weeks ago. It's going to be a little bit here. I think July or August makes the most sense for him. And then you look at what they do up the middle. They've they're on plan F or G in terms of like up the middle options. But you have Story and then Kike in that mix and Christian Arroyo, as I said, Valdez has played well. Even Pablo Reyes has played well. Like they're going to have some options, and I'm sure we'll talk about Duvall in a second. They will there too.
Yeah. So Duvall, I think I don't know if it was you or your colleague at Mass Live reported.
It definitely was not my colleague. No,
it was you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
It was
all
good
right.
stuff.
All right. I know after taking your class that giving credit where it's due, that's so important. Right. So you had the scoop. So I think it was June 9th, if I'm not mistaken, that we're looking at for Adam Duvall.
Yeah, he's on the 60-day IL. That's a product of, partially roster management. Obviously, when you're on the 60, you don't take up a 40-man spot, so they put him there to clear a spot when they needed a pitcher, I think, a couple weeks ago. He can't come back before that date, and I think that's what he told me last week at Fenway, that he's targeting, and, the wrist is healed. Now it's about building strength, getting back into baseball activities, and, at that point, he will. The big battle will be, at that point, does Adam Duvall, go back to center field where Jarren Duran's been so good, one of the hottest hitters in baseball. Great problem to have for the Red Sox, and, you have Yoshida and Verdugo around them too. So good problem for Alex Cora to have, but a problem nonetheless.
Yeah, it's wild how that outfield has produced. And remember when we met in wintertime, we were looking at it as a big question mark. It's actually been one of the pillars of the team. So speaking of things that are pillars of the team, the Red Sox signed Kenley Jansen in the offseason to a contract and surprised a lot of people in that process. First few weeks, he'd been pretty good. Last few outings, not as good. A 5.11 xFIP, some issues going on there. If something were to happen and he was not able to close due to injury or ineffectiveness, who do you see being the next man up there, Chris?
I mean, I think with him, he was so unbelievably lights out. He was throwing 99 at one point and get his 400 save, striking everybody out. The velocity was up. Command was incredible. The blip was kind of two wonky outings against St. Louis a couple weeks ago, and one of them, he was all screwed up. Wilson Contreras was baiting him into pitch clock violations by keeping a foot outside the batter's box. That got some run. MLB had to send a memo that you're not allowed to do that. I mean, it's a fluky thing, I think. Obviously the command has not been there the last couple, outings. I think he walked 2 his last time out over the weekend in San Diego. I don't think the numbers, I think, look a lot worse, right? When it's May and the closer's only been in the game, 15 times, 13 times, whatever. You give up 3 runs and your ERA is all of a sudden inflated. But, it was like a dozen dominant outings before that. So I don't think he's in any danger of losing his job anytime soon. If there were, let's say, if he were to get hurt, something like that, the natural, candidate, Chris Martin, the veteran guy who's been around and done about everything. And then a guy in Josh Winkowski who's been, really a surprise out of the bullpen for the Red Sox too. So, those are a couple of guys, Winkowski and Cutter Crawford and Pivetta. Those are all guys, along with, whoever they're going to take somebody out of the rotation this weekend to fit Whitlock, whoever that is, whether it be Corey Kluber or Tanner Houck, whatever. Those are guys that, have value as relievers because they can give you 2, 3, 4 innings. And we've seen that time and time again from Winkowski and Crawford. So, especially with Schreiber out, some of these guys need to step up. But no, I don't think Jansen's, in jeopardy of losing his job by any means. I think it's just, again, a really wonky outing with the pitch clock stuff, and then just some command loss as well.
Right. Yeah, the Red Sox seem just to have a lot of pieces, like especially once they get these guys back from the injured list, there's going to be a lot of moving parts there. I did want to ask you, Chris, if there's anybody maybe in the minors or flying under the radar who's maybe not getting playing time right now that you could see making a bigger impact as the season goes along.
Yeah, they've kind of dipped into that AAA pool already, kind of the major league ready guys. I mean, you've seen obviously what Drohan has done. Emmanuel Valdez is a guy who, has really hit. I mean, some struggles, defensively, which I know from a fantasy perspective does not matter as much, but he's been their best performer at second base. They tried Arroyo there and Chang and Kike and all those different types of guys. At this point, the reinforcements, most of their prospects are kind of at the lower levels. We've seen a lot of these guys, come up the last couple of years, whether it be, Duran, obviously Casas has been struggling, but struggling at the major league level. And, we've seen kind of this churn of relievers. I mean, the guy who, I would have said was closest to the majors from a pitching perspective heading into the year, Brian Mata, horrible start to the season, no command whatsoever, and now hurt at AAA, so he's not a guy that's going to factor in. A really fast riser up prospect charts, and it's funny, they actually entered the year in terms of pitchers at AAA with Mata, Chris Murphy, and Brandon Walter, 3 of their top pitching prospects there, and all of them really struggled to start the year. The guy that I would be looking at, a guy who just got promoted to AAA, Shane Drohan, a lefty, high pick out of Florida State a few years ago. He's a guy that I think, could really contribute just because he's been such a helium guy this year. So, that's really the guy I'm looking at in terms of AAA. David Hamilton's an interesting one just because he's extremely fast. He's hit well at AAA. But it does say something to me that they, went with Valdez ahead of him, and then they went and got Pablo Reyes ahead of him. Clearly, they don't think he's, ready. But when a guy steals that much, it can change the game in that way. Interesting, too. But, I think I'm actually going up to Portland AA to see those guys tomorrow, and you look at the prospects, and like a lot of those guys are there at the lower levels, and that's just because they've already dipped into that depth pool at AAA so far.
Yeah, it seems like Chaim Bloom has been successful. I know he's taken a lot of criticism, but he's built a deeper system, much deeper than they had previously, and I think he's proving some of his detractors wrong this year, especially given that the big league club is playing as well as it is. So yeah, interesting stuff, Chris. We do have to wrap up. We thank you so much for your time, taking a few minutes here to update us on the Red Sox. If you could just remind our listeners where they can find your work.
Yeah, it's Chris Cotillo on Twitter and masslive.com and the podcast, as we said. New episode out with Chris Mad Dog Russo today, as if there weren't enough Chris's in the mix. And that's the Fenway Rundown on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your pods.
That's awesome.
All right, sounds good. Hey, say hi to Nick Pivetta for me. I know
I will.
That's you.
Yes. I will. Thanks, right, guys. Appreciate it.
Chris, thanks for coming on. We appreciate you.
All right, so good interview here with Chris Cotillo. Now we bring in Craig Mish, host at Sports Grid. He's the guy, you know him, you love him.